Welcome to Syntax. Today we have a great one. We have the latest member of the Syntax team, Chad Whitacre, on the show here to talk all about open source. He's an open source expert of sorts, and he is going to really fill us in about what licenses you should use. Why are people so mad on the internet about open source sometimes? And, just in general about... in general about the topic. So, Chad, first of all, welcome to the Syntax team and welcome to Syntax.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Wes. Happy to be on the team and excited to join you guys for this episode.
Right on. So you want to give us a quick rundown? You're not new to Sentry or open source at all.
No, sir.
You have a bit of a history with open source. You want to give us a
little bit
quick rundown of that whole story and what it is that you do?
Accidental. Open source as a movement started in 1998. I graduated from college in late 99 and started, a career as a programmer in around then, 2000. And so I just kind of grew up as a programmer with open source. Didn't really appreciate until years later that it hadn't always existed. But yeah, long history with open source, really got involved in Python and the Python community in the aughts. So these days it's Django, right? It's Django and it's Flask are the big web frameworks, and there's some newer ones coming out. But back in the 2000s, everybody had a Python web framework. We had these web framework shootouts and all this stuff. There was 20 different Python web frameworks. So I kind of participated in that. I think it was the fifth most downloaded Python web framework in 2008 or something like this. Anyway, yeah. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth in open source and in web programming, and then really experienced, we can see how much this we get into, but really kind of experienced the tension between the fun volunteer open source side of things and then having to have a day job and work on closed source software for money, and kind of the tension between those. And that kind of came to a head for me in about 2012. I started a crowdfunding platform for open source maintainers called GitTip, and I ran that basically through the teens, and then joined Sentry here in 2020, so a few years ago now. So I've been at Sentry for a little over 4 years. I joined as a software engineer on the open source team, working on our self-hosted Sentry, and then also got involved in funding open source maintainers kind of from the Sentry side of things. And that kind of grew into something bigger, and so now I've been promoted to head of open source, and we've launched this open source pledge and all this fun stuff that we can get into. But maybe that's a little bit of a history.
I want to say one thing about Chad is that he's an OG, man. So one thing that we do when we put people on the Syntax website is that we find an old embarrassing photo of them, and I'm a bit of an internet sleuth, I can find things. If we need to find it, we can find things.
Okay.
And I went way back on Chad, and he's got Internet Archive website from when was your first domain?
I bought my first domain in, I think it was April of 2000. So again, I finished school in late 99, and so I wish that I had the domain from pre-millennial era, but 2000 was my first domain.
And for the listeners who are on audio only, Chad is wearing Sony Walkman headphones from 1993, and can you tell us about those a sec?
Yeah, so I mean, these are actually there's a company, I gotta dig it up. There's a company that's making these headphones new again. So these are $15 headphones. I was what? I don't know. Yeah, I've got the nice ones over here too for when I really really need them. But yeah, these are fun. Retrospect, I think, with a K. Let's see if I remembered it. Retrospect with a K.
Yeah. I got to say, anybody who wasn't around for those headphones, they're so funny because the little foam bits, they always eventually just completely deteriorated.
Yeah.
There's one single metal band over the top. It's oh man, I had such fond memories of wearing those headphones with my first Walkman.
Well, it is Retrospect, so retrospect.com with a K, and that you can buy, replacement foams. They have 12 different colors and stuff. It's pretty fun.
Wow, that's so fun.
Yeah, check it out.
That's great.
Yeah. This episode sponsored by
Yeah.
Retrospect. Just kidding.
Man, I can almost smell the like metal
Yes,
band on
yeah,
those headphones.
yeah, you can
It's
smell it.
hilarious.
Yeah.
So what
do that.
are you going to be doing with Syntax then? Like, what's the deal here?
Yeah. So we've, I guess maybe we get into it this way. So maybe revisiting more of the recent history with Sentry. Again, I joined as an IC engineer working on open source, on our self-hosted release and really building out the infrastructure to help Sentry engineers kind of stay on top of GitHub issues to really kind of be practical about it, because Sentry was a growing company. I think when I joined, there was 130 people at the company, and now we're up over 300, we're like 350. And it was hard for, we were like dropping stuff through the cracks on GitHub. So that was a big part of what I focused on at first. But then again, kind of with this funding program, here's the story, okay? Indeed, do you remember Indeed?
Yeah.
Like the jobs
Yes.
board? Okay.
Yes.
Well, Indeed had this program. My friend Dwayne O'Brien, when he was at Indeed, he started this program called FOSS Fund, the FOSS Contributor Fund. And so he had this great program at Indeed where Indeed would pay open source projects, would give money to open source projects. And he had this whole thing. He actually wrote a book on it and published it with O'Reilly about how to run one of these FOSS funds. Sentry was a recipient of one of Indeed's FOSS Fund grants. Because a little history on Sentry, 2008 started as this little open source side project. Wasn't until 2015 that David and Chris, started the company and took venture capital and everything like this. So even a few years after that, Indeed engineers were like, hey, we like Sentry. Sentry's open source. Let's give money to Sentry. And, but by then, we were like off and running on, on the startup path. Didn't need $20,000 or whatever, $10,000 from Indeed. And so we ended up taking that, matching it, and re-gifting it to open source projects. But when I showed up, David Kramer, our technical co-founder, he was like, Chad, he's like, I need you to give $100,000 to open source projects. This was like the year after the Indeed thing, because at the time he had like promised, he's like, yeah, we're going to do this year. We're going to do even more next year. So I showed up and like the first week, I'm here to be like an engineer. And he's like, Chad, give $100,000 to open source projects. I was like, well, that's pretty cool job to have walked into, right? It took about a year to really get organized and get that done. But that first year of funding open source went really well and kind of started my path towards becoming more of a representative of kind of Sentry's open source values, first inside the company, and then kind of as time went on, started to get a higher profile outside the company. Wes, I felt like this was answering a question that you were asking, and now I've lost my train of thought, and I'm hoping that we're going to bring it back
The question
around.
was like, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Right? Because like you joined Sentry,
Yeah,
you're doing all this open source stuff, giving out money. Chad came to us, I don't know, 6 months ago, and was like, hey, Syntax gets $50K.
Yeah, that was fun.
And we get to give that away, right? So we asked the community, like, what project should Syntax give that money to? And that was a really fun and interesting way to figure out how to divvy that up. So
yeah, exactly. So I guess to complete the circuit, started internally focused, grew for a few years there, and then over the past couple years, we've really started to see Sentry's open source funding and some other initiatives as something we want to offer to the broader community, to the broader industry. And so David's really asked me to step forward even more and play more of an external kind of role in promoting Sentry's open source initiatives, open source related initiatives in the community, in the industry. And, and that means kind of, doing more content creation and stepping out. I started a blog, started thinking about video and things like that. And then, you guys are also work with David, and kind of he made the connection. He's like, look, Chad, if you're going to do this, let's do it right. We got this crew here. This is what they do. This is their bread and butter. Let's connect you guys and make it happen.
Yeah, and Chad, you do such an excellent job of teaching open source, which seems to be like I don't know if it's just a topic that people get confused by, or people tend to argue about it quite a bit. But you have a really great blog, the openpath.quest, and it's super informative for anybody who has really not dove into a lot of like deep things inside of open source. What do people get wrong most about open source in general?
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Because open source means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Maybe I'll approach it this way. We have an onboarding session at Sentry that everybody who joins the company goes through. And it's about open source. And the way that I introduce that, so I run that session. And what I say in there is, open source fundamentally is really this brand. It's this name for a thing that anybody who's anywhere close to software at least has some notion of. You've heard of this idea. Okay. It's defined by a certain kind of licensing, so the fine print really is the fine print, it's about the legalese, it's about the licensing. So it's this brand in the software industry that's defined by a certain kind of licensing. And that licensing is designed to encode a public community-centric approach to building software. So that's kind of the heart of open source, is like this public community-centric approach to building software. The legalese is kind of how it gets encoded, and there's a lot of detail in there, but the result is we've got this thing called open source, that anybody who's in software touches in some degree or another. And, you can go as deep as you want down the rabbit hole on it. But that's kind of how I think of it at a high level.
Yeah. What do you think that's why, like the fact that people kind of have a different idea about it? Do you think that's why people tend to get so mad about it on Hacker News? It's like anytime anybody posts anything about open source, there's just like bickering about details.
Yeah, one of the things I see, and maybe this is the biggest problem, getting back to your original question, because it has this legal element to it, it is really easy to get kind of legalistic about it, and to have this, what I think of as kind of a narrow or kind of rigid approach to it. Mm-hmm. And to forget, it's kind of a letter of the law, spirit of the law kind of thing, right? It's like, well, here's the letter of the law, sure. But like, what's the point? Like, why do we have these definitions? Why do we have these, like, these fine print legal things? What's the point? And that's where I get to this idea of this public community-centric approach to building software. It's like, if we lose that, then, it doesn't matter that we're, crossing the T's and dotting the I's on the licenses. It's like, let's keep the main thing without, of course, losing, those definitional aspects.
It's always an interesting question of like, how do you license something so that it's not like you keep that community, you keep the openness, but you also protect the project from being taken advantage of, right? Because like maybe someone's listening and doesn't necessarily understand, but like, what are some bad things that could happen if you just wide open a project? Like, I'm thinking of like one project that's huge is FFmpeg, right? Like tirelessly maintained by several developers and probably billions of dollars of companies sitting on top using that to run companies.
Yeah. Here's the thing about open source. Another thing, we'll throw some things on the table and maybe
get as
make
spicy
the connections.
as you like, Chad.
Yeah. All right. Open source, we think of it in terms of technology. Okay.
Yeah.
And we're all geeks here. We all love the tech and everything and geeking out on the tech. But when we look at this idea of a public community-centric approach to building software, that really gets us outside of technology per se, and it gets us into economics. It gets us into politics. So open source really has all of these like implications or these like tendrils or these meanings or these like things that are really political about it and really kind of economic about it. And I think a lot of the confusion that people have about open source is like is not really recognizing that and not really taking that on board, not really understanding kind of these bigger implications for the thing. Yeah, I mean, so this FFmpeg example, let's maybe go over a little more the detail of what's called the open source definition and how that applies to maybe the specifics of the license and see where we go from there. So before there was open source, there was something called free software, which was a movement started by Richard Stallman in 1983. Okay. And then by the late 90s, folks were trying to take that free software movement and kind of broaden it, take it to the masses. And the term free was confusing because it's like, well, is it free as in beer or free as in speech? This is the way that we thought about it. And so they landed on the term open source as kind of a replacement term. But all of the values of free software are kind of like implicit in the open source movement. Bruce Perens is this fellow that wrote a 10-point definition for free software for the Debian project in like the mid-90s, 96, 97, somewhere there. Bruce is a lawyer. And he wrote this 10-point definition. So that ended up being taken wholesale into the open source movement. They just changed the title. So the free software guidelines became the open source definition. So if you look up open source definition or you go to opensource.org/OSD, you can see these 10 points. So number 1, free redistribution. Number 2, source code is available. Number 3, derived works are allowed, et cetera, right? Like here's 10 points that any software project, licensing needs to fit in order to meet this kind of strict definition according to, this open source initiative authority for open source. Okay. Yeah, well, there's that first one, free redistribution. That's what I'm trying to focus on, okay? Free redistribution. So in order for something to count for open source or free software, clearly it's in the name, you have to be able to take it and use it without any obligation, any requirement that you pay for it, okay? And, Richard Stallman and the people, kind of invested in free software will be like, it's okay to charge for it. You're allowed to do that. But, at the same time, you don't have to. And when people don't have to pay for something, they don't pay for it, right? Is kind of the way of the world. So,
yeah, right. Yeah.
So this is why I say, like, when we talk about FFmpeg being an open source project, and some of the confusion on the internet around like, well, what is an open source project? And, I'll be honest, like Sentry's wandered into this in years past, and it's like been a big part of our story with open source is like, Sentry's a company. We started life as an open source project using an OSI compliant license. What that means is a license that fits this definition that the open source initiative, which is this nonprofit that kind of manages this whole thing, like formally approved by them. We are no longer an open source project. Sentry, the product that we're selling, we relicensed in 2019 away from an OSI compliant BSD license to, at the time, it's called the business source license. Now we use something called the fair source. No, excuse me, I'm going to mess that up forever. Functional source license, which is a fair source license. All right. That's I'm fire hosing here. That's some confusion, but this is
functional.
This is where we get to like.
Yes.
There's a lot of nuance here, right?
Yeah.
So,
totally.
But really, what that comes from is Sentry, meaning like the app that we sell at Sentry.io, on SaaS that you can download and install yourself using self-hosted. That product is owned and run, and the roadmap and the governance, keyword governance, are controlled by a single company, Functional Software Incorporated, C Corp, Delaware C Corp, DBA Sentry. Mm-hmm. Our company is the single vendor, quote unquote. Okay. So you have this concept of single vendor open source. It's like one company controls the whole project. Okay. This is a tension point because it gets back to this idea of open source as really being about a public community centric approach to building a project, right? So really there's this question of like, is an open source project a genuine open source project if a single vendor, if one company wholly controls that project? Then we get into other things like, Linux is the biggest example where we've got a Linux Foundation in which multiple vendors come together and collaborate. So you've got IBM and you've got Google and you've got Huawei and you've got Microsoft, multiple companies. No single company owns that roadmap, owns that project. And so you've got, a multi-vendor or a true community-based open source project. So I don't know. Yeah, fire hose in here, and let me know what we need to go into deeper. But one important way to start wrapping your head around some of the nuance of open source is to recognize the distinction between a single vendor project and a community-led project. So FFmpeg would be on that. I haven't dug deeply into the details, but my understanding of it's on that community side, right? On the one half, we've got multi-vendor community open source. And on the other half, we've got single vendor. But I also want to have another axis here, which is it using an OSI approved license or not? Because that's where some of the roughness comes in is, on the single vendor side, you could be using an OSI approved license or you could be using a non-OSI approved license. And some people want to keep using the term open source for that. But then there's another nuance, which is, all right, we're going to get even more confused before we dig our way out of this.
Let's get into it. Yeah.
There's another nuance, which is there's a particular license called the AGPL, which is kind of like a nuclear license. It's like if your project is licensed under the AGPL, then anything else that touches your software has to also be released. It's a share alike, if you're familiar, like from the Creative Commons, the share alike idea. So the share alike part of open source is called copyleft, and which is distinguished from what we say as permissive open source. Okay.
If I have a project, and I think WordPress is that right? Where
correct.
If I build something on top of WordPress,
GPL.
Whatever I build must also be publicly available and licensed under that.
Yeah.
But people are building WordPress businesses, right? And like this was a huge thing 10 years ago. I remember this big fight where people had themes that they were selling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How do they get around that?
I feel like I'm shooting a little from the hip here because I'm not super familiar with this particular case. Adam Jacob is the best one on this for how to run a true open source business using open source licenses like this. And basically what you do is you to have a business, you have to have something scarce. Let's do it this way. To have a business, you have to have something scarce where you don't get the thing unless you pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so in an open source business, what you do is if the source code is not, if the source code's open source, well, that's not scarce because open source is by definition not scarce. So you have to have something around it, something adjacent to it that is scarce. You have to find something. So the classic open source business model is support. I'm selling my time. My time is scarce. There's only so much of my time to go around. So if you want to use this open source software, I'm a consulting company and you're going to pay me to maintain your IT systems and I'm going to use open source software to do it, but I'm going to be, you're paying me for my labor. So the scarce thing there's the labor. So, whatever the business model is for these plugin businesses, there's something scarce that people are paying for. It could be as simple as the convenience of clicking a button and having that installed on their WordPress system because, WordPress is so popular. Many people using WordPress are not developers, right?
Yeah.
Are not savvy enough that they're going to download that and install it themselves. So that convenience there, you could think of that as a hook, as a scarcity hook that you can charge somebody for. Does that help?
Yeah, totally. It makes sense. I've always been interested in all of these. We'll talk a little bit more about licenses in a little bit, but yeah, that's super interesting.
All right. I want to throw this, I'm not going to say it's the last detail, but another detail at you. So that's that, the GPL, the share alike, we're talking about that. This AGPL is kind of the nuclear version of that, which is like, anything even on the network that touches this has to be released. And what companies will do is they'll add an additional legal document called a CLA, which stands for Contributor Licensing Agreement, which means that, and Sentry's got this, like if anybody shows up at Sentry and gives us a pull request, there's some, now we do it in kind of a goofy way, but there's some boilerplate in our pull request templates that say, I acknowledge by giving you this pull request that, I'm giving you a grant of rights that you can do whatever you want with this. Okay. Because if you don't do this, then, it's a really muddy situation and probably Linux or Debian, or there's like some big projects where it's like you've got thousands of people contributing to it. And if you ever wanted to relicense or do anything with that IP, you would need to contact thousands of people for permission to do it. So what companies do is they make you sign this CLA up front before they accept your contribution to their project. And that way they've got the wherewithal where they can relicense a project or do something different with it in the future. So that combination of the AGPL license, which is a true OSI approved license, plus a CLA is kind of a loophole that companies use to pretend that they're an open source company, but really it's a single vendor. They control it. It's not a true community project. I mean, this is the open core playbook. Open core is a word that's thrown around that's used for this. So like a GitLab or a Calcom or a Plausible or some of these companies where it's like, you can download and you can self-host it maybe. And, the code's on GitHub and you can contribute to it. But when you're contributing to it, you're signing that CLA. So you're not really participating in a community project like an FFmpeg or a Linux. Yeah, and so people that's one of the things people get upset about. It's like people see it as companies taking advantage of developers' free labor.
So you would say that like the nuclear option you mentioned before would be like, in some people's minds, the most pure version of open source. Is that kind of how it's viewed, or is it just like the most intense version of it?
This is where opinions differ.
Yeah.
Between that, what we say is permissive versus copyleft. The copyleft is the share alike that we're talking about. And the difference between the two, permissive is like an MIT license or an Apache license or a BSD license, or my favorite, we can get into the beerware license, where it's like, just do whatever you want, like take the software and do whatever you want with it. They're short licenses, generally speaking, and they're very simple. They're like, take it, do whatever you want. Just, don't sue me if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
On the GPL side, on the copyleft side, they're really long licenses, and they're really trying to use the legal system against itself. It was conceived as this kind of like clever hack on the legal system to be like, all right, companies that love lawyers, like, we're going to come at you with a legal document that forces you to share if you use our stuff, And so then, of course, companies are like, well, like, we're better at this game than you are. We're just going to come back with CLAs, that like, sort of like wall off the garden again. So AGPL, when it's used by a community project, which tends to look like a nonprofit foundation. There'll be a nonprofit foundation that kind of is the umbrella under which multiple companies kind of come together to collaborate. And that nonprofit is the thing that holds the intellectual property for the project. And they're using the AGPL to, preserve that nonprofit ownership of this code and community management of the code. So the AGPL is a little neutral. Like, it could be used kind of in either scenario.
Yeah.
Is it the purest? Sentry's on the permissive side. Our kind of open source values, are really kind of on the permissive side, where it's just like, look, take it, do whatever. Like, we're not here to like fight a legal battle with you. The point is like, we'd rather write code than licenses.
That was my next question. People are probably thinking right now. So when something is, I guess, fair source or source available, but there are limitations on what you can do with that. A, what are you allowed to do? And B, why even have your project open source if people are not able to then take it and use it if that's the case?
So fair source is a term that's been around for a little while, but we kind of took it over last year and we launched this fair source movement, which is really about these companies that want to share. And so far, the best option has been kind of a single vendor open source that, kind of gets you in these fights over what does open source really mean. And we sort of said, okay, let's let go of that battle and let's just have a different name for it. With fair source, you could read the code, you can download the code, you can run the code, you can run the code for your own purposes. You just can't compete with the single vendor company that's producing it in the first place. So for Sentry, our business is all in SaaS. And so we've got our SaaS Sentry, and that's where we make our money. And then we have self-hosted Sentry that people can download and run for themselves. And we've got, 10,000 plus installations of self-hosted Sentry out in the wild. So like, this is actually working. People are using it and getting real value out of Sentry. The limitation thing you can't do with it is you can't stand up a competing SaaS business, because that would undermine our ability, that would undermine our business. What you have to understand is when a company like Facebook puts out React, or a company like Google puts out Kubernetes, okay, they release these kind of big open source projects that we're familiar with, or like the Go language or whatever, right?
Yeah.
When these companies are releasing that software as open source, it's not their core business. Like Google is an ad company. Facebook is an ad company. Facebook's not a software company. They're an advertising company. So for them to release React, it's like, well, they're not, React is like this infrastructure component for them. It's not part of their core business. Sentry's a software company. We sell software. That's our core product. So we need to have a little protection around that. So fair source is an attempt to kind of clean up this mess that we've ended up in after decades of trying to smash these two things together under the open source umbrella, and really, hopefully, free us up as an industry and as a community to really let open source be about this multi-vendor community approach to building software together, and have a clearer path for founders that do want to share, especially developer tools companies. It's like you're not going to have a developer tools company without some kind of open source or sharing strategy. So let's kind of clarify those two things so that we can. I mean, we'll never stop fighting on the internet, Scott, but
yeah,
we can.
That makes so much sense to me, though, in terms of like giving people the opportunity to utilize the code or understand the code or even host it themselves while not allowing somebody to just copy it and make a business out of it. I guess that just makes too much sense to me. Yeah, to get angry about that. And if you want to see all of the errors in your application, you'll want to check out Sentry at sentry.io/syntax. You don't want a production application out there that, well, you have no visibility into in case something is blowing up and you might not even know it. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Again, we've been using this tool for a long time and it totally rules. All right.
I'm just looking into another piece of software right now that I've been touching a lot, and that is 3D printing slicing software, which is basically you take like a model, like I've got like a little M24 nut or a bolt right here, and it cuts it into layers and allows you to print it. And there's a whole bunch of like mathematics into like how do you orient and whatnot, all kinds of features. The software that I use is called Bamboo Studio, which is by this company, and they basically forked Prusa Slicer. There's another one called Orca Slicer. They're all based on the same thing, and Bamboo forked it and started adding all these like nice features, like different types of supports and whatnot. But they didn't make it open source, and everyone freaked out because the Prusa Slicer is AGPL. I just looked it up, right? So they have to make that open source, right? And it's a net win for the community because Bamboo was able to get a really good base and start building on top of that. And now they have to make their stuff open source, which the other projects can now then take that. Oh, they added tree supports. Let's take that. Or they added in auto arrangement. Let's take that feature and port it back to our own. And it's nice because now the software for the entire industry is all these companies have their own software if they want to, but they're all kind of helping each other out.
Wow. Yeah, I'm seeing this. I guess it's a couple years ago, but yeah, this blog post, AGPL compliance of Bamboo Studio.
Yes.
It's interesting. I hadn't seen this case. Yeah.
It's a wild world. It's not just software, right? Like even I don't have an example right here as well, but I'm getting into this like multi-board, which is for hanging stuff up, and the guy who designed it like wants it to be open source, but he doesn't want like some like IKEA coming and just injection molding
eating his lunch.
10 million of them and then making all money off of it. So it's kind of tricky.
Yeah. I mean, so you can see where what starts out as, we're having fun building tech together gets into these really thorny kind of economic questions and political questions. And like, what does it mean to have a society together kind of questions? Like, as you start pulling on the thread, it's like, whew. Yeah.
Yeah. So my next question then is, when you simply just npm install something and you might have dependencies 11 layers deep, should we be concerned about that? Let's say someone's building an app that they want to one day sell. Should we be concerned about that? Even like when Syntax joined Sentry, we had to go through our package JSON and find every license all the way down, and we gave it to the lawyers.
Just give it to the lawyers. To
make sure there's none of that AGPL in there, right? None of that viral, so to speak, copyleft licensing. I mean, it's definitely something to be aware of, and it's absolutely, I mean, like you experienced at any scale, you're going to need to, and there's tooling for this now. FOSSA is one that we use internally to keep track of our licenses. We're kind of too far gone with it. It's like anymore you can't, the stats of these things are always questionable, but like 90+% of any code base is open source components. Like if you look at any of the apps on your phone or whatever websites that you're using, it's like, it's like an iceberg of open source with like a little bit of proprietary on top, Were you the one that had to go through that, Wes?
Well, luckily I found a tool to do that, but I dug into it and I found some tool that would just crawl your package JSON, and we gave this massive spreadsheet to the lawyers. We're like, here you go,
enjoy.
You asked for it.
That happened when I was working at Ford, though. We went to install something, and then the lawyers were like, we can't use this. And I'm okay. I guess we're rolling this by hand then. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of people do that. Or
Yeah.
I'll often have a repo where I don't add a license because for whatever reason, and then someone or someone simply wants you sometimes hit upon a GitHub gist, 8
Right.
lines of code, and there's someone in the comments, can you please add a license to this? I need to copy paste this into our code base.
Yeah. No, more enlightened lawyer will let you get away with 8 lines.
Yeah.
From somewhere. But but left pad, right? How many NPM packages are only a couple lines?
Yeah, no kidding.
Chad, what's the most interesting open source license? The most unusual, I suppose.
The most interesting? Is that a leading question, Scott?
No.
Because I was about to bring up.
T-ball.
The one I'm loving right now is this beerware license that you guys have seen me talk about in our channel. And I guess I mentioned a little earlier here. And I was thinking about it just now because you're talking about having to go through the audit of everything, in syntax. With open source licenses, you can do whatever you want with it, but almost always you have to include what's called attribution. So you have to actually include the text of the license when you incorporate a component into your own app. All right, and so any company of any size is doing this, in some way. And so on your phone or in any of the apps that you're using that use all this open source software, there has to be some place where they're listing, here's the components we're using, and here's the license, which is, essentially this permission slip from the author to use the thing. Okay. 20 years ago, probably. Yeah. I mean, I went back and looked. I actually used this license for a bunch of code in the aughts. It's called the beerware license. Okay. And it comes from a developer named Paul Hennenkamp, who wrote like half of FreeBSD. He wrote this HTTP cache called Varnish, which is a popular HTTP cache that basically got commercialized as Fastly. So Fastly like came out of the Varnish community and is built on top of Fastly. A lot of PHK goes by PHK. A lot of his code is licensed under what he came up with. He calls it the beerware license. And it's supposed to be this like anti-lawyer license. Yeah, I'm going to read it to you here. The beerware license. The beerware license revision 42. PHK at FreeBSD.org wrote this file. As long as you retain this notice, you can do whatever you want with this stuff. If we meet someday and you think this stuff is worth it, you can buy me a beer in return. Paul Hennenkamp. That's it. That's the license.
That's
no
the whole
legalese.
license.
Just like, hey, if you like it, buy me a beer.
I love it.
And I used this, I found this license in like 2005 or whatever. I was like, oh man, that's cool, And so I like put it on a bunch of stuff. What I really like about this license though, obviously it's fun, it's tongue in cheek. And I guess going back to what I was saying earlier, Apple, you'd think, okay, this is just like a joke, right? But Apple has components that they're using for iOS that, PHK wrote and licensed under the beerware license, which means that Apple has to include in the legal notices, like if you go into settings, you go into legal notices, whatever, and you scroll down far enough, you'll see beerware license. You're like, I love it because it's like Apple is such a buttoned up, like the most buttoned up of companies, right? Like with the most controlled kind of image. And then it's like they have to put this beerware license. I get a kick out of it. This, of all the licenses that I'm aware of, actually does the best job of pointing to what we've kind of been, that thread that we've been pulling on, which is that open source has economic implications. Open source has political implications. Because in here, this idea that it's like, hey, if you like this, feel free to buy me a beer sometime. That's an exchange, as funny as it is. That's an exchange. It's an indication of the back and forth of open source. And, you could say in the AGPL and the GPL and that share like stuff, you have it, but that's such like an arm twisting, like using the law against them to force them to share. And this is much more like, I love the posture of this, which is invitation, invitation. I see open source as an invitation. It's a gift. Open source is like, hey, here's the software I wrote. Feel free to use it. And hey, do you have any software you'd like to share? Do you have any beer you'd like to buy me? Do you have any extra computers lying around that you'd like to give me as an exchange, as a reciprocal gift for this thing that I've given you?
Mm-hmm.
Because that, to me, again, getting back to like the letter and the spirit, like to me that's the fun of open source, right?
Yeah.
Like that's really what it's all about, is like people working together, collaborating, building stuff, and getting way further than we could on our own. Yeah, so as funny as the beerware license is, I think there is a really deep insight kind of embedded in that.
Yeah, I love that. Let's talk about the open source pledge really quick.
Yeah,
you had
sure.
mentioned that you'd worked on the open source pledge at Century. We've talked about it a bit on this show already, but can you give the audience a rundown about like what the open source pledge is and who's involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So the open source pledge is Century's attempt to get other companies to give as much money to open source as we do. Because again, going back to my own history here, like I started this, David was like, Chad, give money to open source. So I gave a bunch of money to open source. And then the next year he was like, Chad, give even more money to open source. And so I gave even more money to open source. Then the third year, we doubled the amount again. We gave $500,000 to open source.
Crazy. Yeah.
In year 4, we were like, okay, this is cool, but we can't be the only ones doing this. Like that, that's fun and like people are loving what we're doing and it's great. But to really have an impact on this question, we say, of open source sustainability, or this way to make sure that the people building FFmpeg and all the tools we depend on, that we're not burning them out. We need an industry-wide change. We need kind of a culture change in how we think about this and act on it. And so that's what the pledge is about. So the pledge is a group of companies working together to change the status quo in open source sustainability. So there's this classic XKCD comic. It's called Dependency. I think it's number 2347. And it's got this like Jenga tower, of blocks kind of built on top of each other. And it says, here's all modern digital infrastructure. And it's resting on this one little kind of precarious component that says a project from 2003, thanklessly maintained by some guy in Nebraska. Okay. That is the problem we're trying to solve with the pledge. We're trying to get that guy in Nebraska who's been thanklessly maintaining that project since 2003 paid so he doesn't burn out and the whole thing collapses. And yeah, so we've got, we launched about 6 months ago. For a company to join the pledge, they need to, number 1, pay maintainers, and then number 2, blog about it. So there's a threshold amount, which is a function of the number of developers employed at the company. So if a company employs 100 developers, the figure is $2,000 per developer. That's the minimum. So if a company employs 100 developers, they would pay maintainers $200,000, and then they would write a blog post that says, our company loves open source and we pay maintainers, and here's the receipts. We want those receipts. We want that accountability. And then, we onboard them and put them on the website. We just rolled out a job board a few weeks ago. So we're, trying to find ways to add value for those companies to say like, hey, this is a little movement. This is worth being part of. Yeah, it's been fun. If you're listening to this and your company uses open source software, then you should encourage your company to join the open source pledge.
Totally. It's over $2.5 million on there. Some pretty big companies have joined.
Yeah, Laravel's with us. It was really fun. A company called Posit joined. None of us had ever heard of them. They self-serve, found us and joined. They do they have a data science IDE in R, this old data science language. And they've got more developers than Sentry does. So they joined, just at the end of December, a few months after we launched. So really encouraging to see companies, start to get on board with this and work together.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
$3,679 per dev, and there's 134 devs.
Yeah, right.
That is awesome.
Pushing over 2.5 million, and Sentry is only 750 of that. So much more that's not Sentry than is.
You guys rolled out some like hilarious billboards as well. What were those? There's 3 of them, right?
Yeah. Oh goodness, yeah. We launched the open source pledge last year on October 8th, and we did it. We rented 3 of the most expensive billboards in the world, and Sentry's creative team, we call them Studio 404 internally here. They had a lot of fun coming up with a campaign for us. that we called mooch monsters. So we've got the CEO, who's the chief excuse officer. We've got the CFO, that's the chief freeload officer, and the CTO, that's the chief tightwad officer. And actually, just last week, because we did those 3 billboards, but we also got a bunch of buses and bus shelters, and they're still running around because those buses, they don't change them as quick as the billboards, right? So like, there's still chief CTO, chief tightwad officers running around San Francisco. It's pretty fun.
That's great.
Yeah, we saw some of those in SF. They're pretty eye-catching. They're pretty dope. Yeah.
We got an article in the Register about the billboard. It's like, since when are billboards news? It's like new billboard goes up on the freeway or whatever. It's like, yeah. Well, and then the other one, we were in Times Square too. The NASDAQ jumbotron.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah,
Times Square. Yeah, we were on there as well for
amazing
with a bunch of the launch partners, the innovators we call them, the innovators that joined with us for that launch. So that's the name of the game now. Is we just got to keep growing. We got to get more and more companies on board, chip away. I mean, it's a weird kind of startup, right? Where it's like we're tracking ARR and we're trying to grow and we're like, trying to get out there and not die.
I got a question for you, Chad.
Yeah.
What license should I use?
I like it. Well, it depends on your goals. There's different life cycle stages for an open source project. So I think you're probably asking from the point of view of kind of a solo maintainer, right? Who maybe has a fun idea and some spare time and nights and weekends and, puts together a project. The 2 fundamental paths you can go down are the permissive or the copyleft. I like the permissive side. I'm not really looking to use the law against people. It's like, I'm going to get outlawyered one way or another. If you're of that bent, then sure, use the GPL or look into it. Here's what I want to use this question to say. I see the copyleft style as more niche and more niche as time goes on. Because I think most people fundamentally don't care. You have to really care. You have to really be an insider and really like geek out on the licenses and reading the licenses and everything like that. You have to kind of be an activist to bring that word in, So copyleft, free software, so to speak, I see that more for activists, which just, by definition are going to be a much smaller, proportion. And I think open source, we need to blow this up even bigger than it is. I think permissive is the thing that is going to resonate more with more people and is truer to what I understand to be that kind of heart of open source, which is really about that community aspect, which is like, I don't know, man. It's like if somebody's coming at me and trying to twist my arm to do this or that, like to force me to share, like that's not how, like, that feels just kind of dumb to me. Like, you can't force people to share, right? The whole point is we're inviting people to share. We're inviting people into this community. And to me, copyleft misses the point. So use a permissive license. The MIT is one of the most established licenses. That's, you can't go wrong with MIT. Apache has a little more legalese in there that gives you some nuanced protections around patents, very popular license. Those are the 2 that we use at Sentry, by the way. MIT we use for all of our SDKs, and then Apache we use for other components, that we release. Of course, we do also use our functional source license for Sentry itself. I'm talking about the true open source stuff that we put out. So MIT, Apache, or if you really want to have some fun, use that beerware license. That'd be my recommendation.
Love it. Yeah. I like beer.
Have you guys ever put anything out open source? What's your own history with publishing projects?
Tons of it out there.
Anything anybody else is using, Wes? Like, what's your most popular open source project?
My most popular module is the most embarrassing thing. It's called Wait. If you go to npm.im/WAAIT,
AAIT, 2 A's?
Yeah, because the one wait was taken, and it's simply a one-line.
That's branding right there, my friend. Yeah.
It's just a function that returns a promise after however many seconds you pass it, or milliseconds.
And you used MIT on it. There you go.
And it's got 100,000 people a week. It used to be even higher before AI would inject it, because It's a one-line package, but embarrassingly popular.
I love it. And it's 7 years ago. You put it out 7 years ago, and it's still
7
going?
years ago, updated it, I guess.
Oh,
Or
okay.
6 years ago, last published. There's no features that needed to be added.
It's the perfect package.
Yes, exactly.
Doesn't need anything.
I'm just going through the iOS legal page. I found a copy of it online, and
I was
going to
say you got to get it. Yeah, it's tough to scroll.
Yeah, they don't let you copy the whole thing, but somebody figured out how to put it on a GitHub gist, and I searched for all of the JavaScript libraries that were used in iOS.
Yeah.
And
you finding some good stuff?
There's not a lot. It's jQuery and Ember.js. I'm pretty sure Apple Music is built with Ember, or at least
Apple
parts
Music
of it.
is built with Svelte.
Is it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, at some point, Apple used Ember for something. I'm curious what that is. And obviously, they still have jQuery in there somewhere. And then there's one for WebRTC JavaScript library. I'm curious, maybe FaceTime's built with JavaScript.
And you find that beerware in there? Did you find that?
I did find the beerware in there. It makes me want to make a funny license now, and if if it's ever used,
playing the long game.
Yeah,
totally.
Yeah,
but every now and then, if I go into a car and into legal notices, I scroll, and I remember
see what's in there.
We used to have a BMW, and I scrolled, and I found a whole bunch of JavaScript libraries in there as well.
Mercedes actually has, some of the car companies are starting open source programs.
Really?
So Mercedes-Benz has one of these FOSS funds, if I remember right, or they at least have an open source program that you can find. And let me just think, for some reason I feel like Porsche had an open source program. Yeah, Porsche, opensource.porsche.com. Yeah, so Porsche is in the open source game. Maybe that's
I found that. I'll post a link to the Mercedes has a blog post about their Mercedes embraces open source to drive its digital ecosystem. Cool.
It's pretty cool, right?
To drive its that's fun.
There you go.
Yeah.
Speaking of like interesting licenses, though, I need to find one for my teaching content, because I publish lots of examples and stuff online, and all of my course content is open source, and I just explicitly put there, like, you can do whatever you want. You can make a startup. This app that we're talking on right now was based on some of my course code. But I was like, the only thing you can't do is you can't make another course teaching the exact same thing, which unfortunately has happened a few times.
Yeah.
So I had to add that in there. But like I just put it in the README, and maybe I need a explicit license.
What about Creative Commons? Any of those Creative Commons licenses appropriate?
It might. The thing is, like, I never know what to use. And I think a lot of people are like that. I usually just throw MIT on there because I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. Creative Commons is very similar, of course, to open source, but is really designed for everything except software. And open source is really about software. So if you're talking about like code examples and stuff like that, that's the sweet spot for open source. If you're talking about content, otherwise, that's what Creative Commons is there for. I don't know if because there is a non-commercial variant in Creative Commons, that might do it. Because they have like a mix and match, right? They have like 4-ish different kinds of restrictions you can put and still fit in the Creative Commons bucket. And you can kind of pick and choose which of those you want to bring in.
Maybe I'll take a look into that. It's for me, it's mostly just the software that I write, like the actual code.
Yeah,
not the videos themselves. All have their own individual.
You might need fair source, Wes.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, you can't commercialize it.
I need to join on. Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, is I want people to be able to commercialize it. People have started taking the code, and they've built startups off of it. I want people to.
What you don't want is people to compete with you.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, is I don't want somebody taking the exact same code and the words that I've spoken and just re-recording them.
Yeah.
Or doing it in another language or something like that, and without explicit permission.
Yeah. So that is really that fair source idea. This idea that companies that are, public on GitHub with their code, but have, whether it's that AGPL with the CLA or using a fair source license, that there's this kind of dark aspect to it. People were like, well, you're just, stealing our labor and, taking advantage of us. And I'll tell you what, I feel differently about it. I think those people are mostly just grumps and are going to hate anything, in my experience. and represent kind of the worst of the open source community because they're just like using the legalese of it to browbeat people. Plausible. You familiar with Plausible? They're like the Google Analytics. Yeah.
I think we use it on the syntax side, don't we?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, I love Plausible. They are one of these open core companies that's AGPL with a CLA. And I have a contribution in Plausible. I gave them a pull request. Like this is 5 years ago or whatever, 6 years ago. They were a little newer. And yeah, there was like a little thing I didn't like about what they're doing. And because they were on GitHub, I could go in and I could, make a pull request, and they accepted it. And now it's in there. And I don't at all feel taken advantage of by Plausible. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to maintain that code forever. You know what I mean? It's like, I want to come in, fix my problem, and then go on with my day. And to me, that's part of the beauty of, whether it's open source or even this kind of fair source model. Like, I love that. I love that I, as an individual, if I'm sufficiently motivated, I can go fix that problem. There's these kind of meme stories that go around of the person that gets hired at the company and fixes the bug that's annoyed them forever and then quits after 2 weeks because they only got hired in order to fix that bug, right? Yeah. Yeah. So this, right? It's like that's a joke because that's so hard to do. But what if it weren't hard to do? What if, and the fact is, this Plausible example is a real world example of that, where it's like, that's the value of kind of that fair source model, or certainly an open source model. And so I don't see a problem with companies operating that way, because they're honest, as long as you're honest about it, which is like, hey, we're a company, this is our thing, you're welcome to give us contributions, and it's, again, invitation. It's like nobody's twisting your arm to force you to contribute to something. It's like,
right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's value there in both approaches. Scott, how about you? Do you have any open source projects?
Yeah, you know what? I have one that I did recently, and it doesn't have a license on it, so I should probably put one. It's just the bindings for Zero Sync, which is a local first syncing platform. So I wrote the Svelte bindings for that. Nice. I have a number of little small utilities that like an automatic Babel plugin for auto importing certain files and stuff like that, but nothing crazy. Most of my stuff has just been the educational content that I just throw up on GitHub. Yeah.
Do you guys ever contribute to other projects in open source?
Oh yeah, quite a bit. I love that about open source projects is you can just do drive by, fix something and get going.
So you're actually giving PRs, Wes, not just issues. I mean,
oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you take a look at my GitHub profile, you'll see it.
Okay, see some contributions.
Yeah, when I first got started in GitHub, maybe like 12 years ago, I was Mr. Docs, boom. But
Mr. Docs,
much more of like, I still do quite a bit of docs because they're unfortunately kind of neglected in many use cases. But I would say like my most is simply issues with replications. Quite
super
a bit
valuable,
of,
a high quality bug reports.
Oh man, thing. Sometimes I just get so exhausted when you like open up a new issue and it's like, here, fill out this
Here's
book.
The template.
Give me a whole code sandbox. I'm like, but I realize on the other end as well. It's like, well, I don't know if this issue that you're having, please show me how it actually works.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, that just goes to show you how much labor does go into open source,
Yeah.
And if you can spread it around a little bit, if we can, I don't know. I kind of think, company like Sentry, given a lot of money, we're doing that. Here's what I'm trying to say. There's different ways for each of us to participate in the open source ecosystem and make it stronger. If you're a company and you can give $750,000 to open source, that's awesome. If you're an individual developer and you come across a bug in upstream, taking half an hour to write that book and give them that reproducible bug report, that is actually valuable. And if we could have kind of everybody do a little bit, then we all benefit from it. You don't have to think, well, I'm not a Sentry that can give all this money. Like there is absolutely stuff that you can do to participate one notch, more than some of us are doing.
Totally. Yeah. And maintainers like that though, because you give them a failing test, even takes you half an hour. Sometimes they can just 10 minutes, fix it, push a new version.
Oh yeah. Yeah, man. If you're a maintainer and you get a really good bug report, I mean, that lights up your day, after all the trash that you get, especially with like the AI generated slop now. It's like maintainers are flooded with it. So if you come in with some valuable info, that's gold.
All right, should we wrap this up, Scott?
Yeah, I think it's a good time to do that. Let's get into the part of the show where we talk about sick picks and shameless plugs. Chad, a sick pick is something that you're just liking right now, enjoying anything.
Oh, goodness.
Do you have a sick pick?
Oh, well, you guys know where my head's at, and this episode is supposed to air with my first salvo on the Syntax channel. I'm really enjoying these Save the Cat books about screenwriting and writing narrative story content. So shout out to this fella, Jamie Nash, who wrote a book about writing for TV using this Save the Cat beat sheet method. So look into it if you want to understand about screenwriting, I guess.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
Nice.
I'll give that one.
Yeah. What about shameless plugs? Would you like to plug anything?
Oh, man. What's the difference between a pick and a plug, Wes?
A sick pick is what you just gave, and a plug is like you want to
My own thing?
Yeah,
I gotta
your
show
own
my
thing.
own thing?
Yeah.
Well, then
Chill
the
time.
obviously compliment is like, yeah, go watch my show on Syntax that's coming out together with this episode. That's an easy one.
Yeah.
Cool.
Chad's going to be talking about open source and giving us all some
Oh,
some
my goodness.
really interesting open source information in various ways. So we're really, really stoked to have
I'm
Chad
gonna pull
jump on the
that
team.
thread.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
pull on
that
the thread.
and see where it goes. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, so looking super forward to that, Chad. It's awesome. It's been great having you on the team so far, and I can't wait to see your show and what you put out.
What the future holds. This is
All
great.
right, thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Scott.
Peace.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks, Chad.